My father-in-law spent the entire Thanksgiving dinner mocking my boring government desk job. Less than 12 hours later, he was sweating through his designer bespoke suit when I walked into his corporate office wearing my IRS badge. The frosted glass doors of Sterling Pinnacle Real Estate shattered the morning silence as they were pushed open precisely at 8 a.m. It was Black Friday. The rest of the city was sleeping off their turkey dinners, but the 32nd floor of this Class A commercial high-rise was suddenly swarming with 15 federal agents. They wore heavy, dark windbreakers with the bright yellow letters IRS-CI stamped across their backs. I stood near the elevator banks, watching the chaotic symphony unfold. Richard, my father-in-law, was practically vibrating with arrogant outrage. He stood behind his massive imported Italian marble desk, a man accustomed to untouchable power, waving his arms at the lead agent. The scent of his morning Cuban cigar and expensive Tom Ford cologne hung heavy in the air, mixing with the sharp, clinical smell of ozone and fear. "Do you have any idea who I am?" Richard bellowed, his face flushing a deep, dangerous purple. "I play golf with the mayor. I own half the commercial real estate in this district. Get out of my office before I have every single one of you fired." He reached for his phone, his hands shaking so violently his solid gold Patek Philippe watch clattered against the marble desk. That was the moment I stepped out from the shadows of the hallway and walked into his office. I wasn't wearing the clearance rack sweater I had worn to his dinner table the night before. I was wearing a tailored black blazer, my hair pulled back into a severe professional knot. I reached to my belt, unclipped my leather badge holder, and let it hang from a silver chain around my neck. The heavy gold shield of the Internal Revenue Service Criminal Investigation Division caught the morning light. "I want you to freeze the frame right there." Look at the exact second his brain registered my face, my suit, and the federal badge resting on my chest. Watch the blood physically drain from his cheeks, leaving him a hollow, trembling ghost. That look of absolute soul-crushing terror, that is the look of a narcissistic, untouchable titan who just realized that the lowly paper pusher he had spent 5 years humiliating was actually the architect of his total financial ruin. Welcome back to the channel. Before I take you through the agonizing years of psychological abuse that led to this moment and the multi-million-dollar legally binding federal raid that ended it, please take a quick second to hit the like button and subscribe. If you believe that the most devastating revenge isn't delivered through screaming matches or physical violence, but through cold, calculated financial execution and the undeniable power of the law, you are in exactly the right place. Also, drop a comment down below and let me know. Where in the world are you watching from right now, and what time is it there? I read every single one of your comments, and it always amazes me how far these stories travel. Now let me tell you how I weaponized forensic accounting to systematically dismantle the family that treated me like trash. My name is Chloe. To understand the absolute chilling irony of Richard's downfall, you have to understand the suffocating psychological prison of my marriage. I grew up in a working-class neighborhood where every grocery receipt was calculated and every dollar was earned with calloused hands. I was taught that integrity and justice mattered more than optics. I worked 2 jobs to pay my way through a rigorous accounting and criminal justice degree. When I met Greg, I thought I had found a partner who respected that grind. Greg was a mid-level manager, charming, soft-spoken, and came from what people call new money. I mistook his quiet demeanor for humility. I didn't realize until I had a ring on my finger that I had simply married a coward, a spineless textbook golden child who possessed absolutely no identity outside of his father's immense wealth and approval. Richard was the patriarch, a man who built a lucrative real estate empire and believed his net worth made him a god. Every Sunday, Greg and I were summoned to Richard's sprawling 8-bedroom estate for family dinners. The house was a monument to his narcissism. It smelled perpetually of aged leather, expensive scotch, and lemon floor polish. The driveway was always lined with leased German luxury cars. The moment I crossed the threshold, the gaslighting began. Richard didn't yell. He didn't use profanity. He used a fake, sugary sweet tone that disarmed you right before he cut you to the bone. Chloe, sweetie, Richard would purr, swirling a glass of Macallan 25, his eyes scanning my modest clothes with thinly veiled disgust. Greg tells me you're still working at that little government agency. It's so cute that you want to serve the public. But you know, in the real world, we actually create jobs. We build the economy. Someone has to pay the taxes that fund your little clerical salary, right? He would laugh, a booming, hearty sound, and the entire table, including my husband, would chuckle along with him. I would sit there, my hands gripping my napkin under the table, completely silent. I was the designated scapegoat. I was the charity case they allowed at their table so Richard could feel magnanimous. He was deeply engaged in projecting conditional self-worth onto everyone around him. In his house, your value as a human being was strictly tied to your tax bracket. If you weren't making millions, you were a parasite. I looked at Greg, waiting for him to defend his wife, waiting for him to tell his father to stop. Instead, Greg would just look at his plate, shift his weight, and mutter, "He's just joking, Chloe. Don't be so sensitive. Don't cause drama." I learned to swallow my pain. I learned to smile politely and eat my dinner, because what Richard and Greg didn't know was that I wasn't a clerical worker stamping forms at the DMV. Because of federal non-disclosure protocols and operational security, I kept my exact title extremely vague to my in-laws. They thought I was a low-level auditor. I was actually a senior forensic accountant for the IRS Criminal Investigation Division. My daily job was tracking global money laundering networks, dismantling shell companies, and hunting down white-collar criminals who thought they were smarter than the federal government. The first massive red flag appeared during a lavish charity gala Richard hosted in the winter of my 3rd year of marriage. It was a $2,000 a plate event held at the Ritz-Carlton, supposedly to raise funds for underprivileged youth. The ballroom was dripping in excess, truffle hors d'oeuvres, towers of champagne, women in silk and diamonds. I was wearing a dress I bought on clearance, feeling the weight of 100 judgmental stares. Richard dragged Greg and me around the room, introducing us to his wealthy cronies. "This is my son, the vice president of our commercial division," Richard boasted, clapping Greg on the back. Then he gestured vaguely to me. "And this is his little wife, Chloe. She stamps papers for the government. Bless her heart, she tries." I offered a quiet, stoic smile, allowing them to laugh. But while they were drinking, my forensic eye was scanning the room. I looked at the promotional banners. I looked at the glossy brochures detailing the charity's operations. The catering was provided by a company called Apex Horizon Logistics. The event management was billed to Sterling Consulting LLC. To an ordinary person, those are just corporate names. To a forensic accountant, it is a glaring neon sign. Both of those companies were registered in Delaware. They had no public digital footprint, no physical storefronts, and their board of directors were obscured by registered agents. It was a classic, textbook shell company structure. Richard wasn't hosting a charity gala to help children. He was using a 501c3 nonprofit organization as a legal washing machine to launder his real estate profits, inflate his vendor invoices, and commit massive multi-million-dollar tax evasion. Let me pause right here and talk to you directly. Have you ever looked at someone who constantly preaches about morality, someone who uses their wealth to make you feel like dirt, only to realize they are the biggest, most pathetic fraud in the room? Have you ever had a partner tell you that you were causing drama just because you demanded basic human respect? What would you have done sitting at that gala? Would you have confronted him, or would you have started gathering the paper trail? Tell me your story in the comments. We have all faced a narcissist who uses money as a weapon, and reading how you survived your situation gives immense strength to someone else right now. Because what Richard didn't realize as he stood on that stage, accepting applause for his fake generosity, was that he had just handed the blueprint of his criminal empire to a federal investigator. And I was about to spend the next 2 years quietly, legally mapping out his absolute destruction. The next 2 years were a masterclass in psychological endurance. I couldn't just walk into my office on Monday morning and open an investigation on my father-in-law. The federal government has incredibly strict laws regarding conflicts of interest. If I even accessed his tax records through the IRS database using my credentials, any evidence I gathered could be thrown out in court as fruit of the poisonous tree. I had to do it the hard way. I had to operate entirely through publicly available data, open source intelligence, and the Freedom of Information Act. During the day, I hunted down drug cartels and corporate embezzlers, but at night, sitting in the dark of my home office while Greg slept, I became a phantom. I pulled public property records, I tracked cross-border real estate acquisitions, I traced the board members of his vendors through corporate filings in Delaware and the Cayman Islands. I was meticulously untangling a massive, incredibly complex web of synthetic fraud. Richard was funneling millions of dollars of taxable commercial real estate revenue into his charity, claiming massive tax deductions. The charity was then paying grossly inflated, ridiculous invoices to the shell companies, Apex Horizon Logistics and Sterling Consulting LLC, for services that were never actually rendered. Those shell companies were secretly owned by Richard, allowing him to quietly pocket the money completely tax-free. It was arrogant, sloppy, and deeply illegal. Once I had a 300-page dossier built entirely on open-source, legally undeniable evidence, I compiled it into a sterile, anonymous whistleblower report. I handed it off to the special agent in charge of a different regional field office. Because of the scale of the fraud, the agency moved on it quickly. A federal grand jury secretly convened. Subpoenas were quietly issued to banks. The snare was slowly, invisibly tightening around Richard's ankle. Because I was the initial anonymous whistleblower and a subject matter expert on complex real estate fraud, I was formally temporarily assigned to the task force in an advisory capacity. While the federal machine turned its gears in the dark, my personal life was a suffocating hell. I had to maintain the illusion of the quiet, submissive, low-class daughter-in-law. Every Sunday dinner, every holiday, I had to sit at Richard's massive dining table and swallow his poison. "Still pushing pencils for the feds, Chloe?" Richard would ask, swirling his wine, a cruel smirk dancing on his lips. "You know, if you ever want a real job, I could probably find a spot for you answering phones at my front desk. The pay is probably better than what the taxpayers give you." Greg would laugh, a hollow, pathetic sound. "Dad, come on, she likes the easy hours." I would just smile, take a bite of my food, and look Richard dead in the eye. "I'm actually working on a very interesting project right now, Richard," I would say softly, my voice perfectly level. "It's amazing how much you can learn about a person just by looking at their paperwork." He thought I was making a pathetic attempt to sound important. He had no idea I was literally staring at a dead man walking. The breaking point arrived exactly 12 hours before the raid. It was Thanksgiving night. Richard had invited 40 of his most affluent, high society friends, investors, and local politicians to his estate. The dining room was an absolute spectacle of excess, towering floral arrangements, crystal chandeliers, and a massive, perfectly roasted turkey resting on a silver platter. I was seated near the end of the table, next to a local city councilman who hadn't spoken 2 words to me all evening. Greg was seated near his father, desperately trying to insert himself into a conversation about commercial zoning permits. I checked my watch under the table. It was 8:30 p.m. My phone buzzed silently in my pocket. It was a secure message from the special agent in charge. "Warrants signed, briefing at 0500, execution at 0800. I took a slow, deep breath, letting the cool air fill my lungs. The execution order was final. Tomorrow morning, Richard's empire would cease to exist. Richard stood up at the head of the table, tapping his crystal wine glass with a silver spoon. The room fell into an obedient, respectful silence. "Family and friends," Richard began, his chest puffed out, radiating that toxic, narcissistic glow. "I want to thank you all for being here tonight. As I look around this table, I see the people who actually build this city. the job creators, the visionaries. He paused, letting the applause wash over him. Then his eyes sought me out at the far end of the table. The corners of his mouth curled upward in that familiar, vicious sneer. And of course, we must give thanks for the less ambitious among us, Richard said, his voice dripping with condescension, making sure the entire room of 40 wealthy elites was watching. Take my daughter-in-law, Chloe, for example. She spends 40 hours a week sitting in a gray cubicle, stamping forms for the government, while we are out here actually generating the wealth that pays her meager salary. A truly boring existence. But hey, someone has to do the paperwork, right? The table erupted in laughter. It wasn't polite chuckling, it was deep belly laughs from people who enjoyed seeing someone beneath them put in their place. I looked at Greg, my husband, the man who had vowed to protect me. He was laughing too, shaking his head, looking down at his plate so he wouldn't have to meet my eyes. I didn't flush with embarrassment. I didn't cry. I didn't storm out of the room. I simply reached for my wine glass, lifted it slightly in the air toward Richard, and offered him a slow, cold, utterly serene smile. "Happy Thanksgiving, Richard," I said softly, my voice carrying just enough to reach him over the fading laughter. "You have absolutely no idea how exciting my paperwork is about to become." He rolled his eyes, dismissing my comment as the pathetic defense of a defeated woman, and turned back to his wealthy friends. He spent the rest of the evening drinking expensive scotch and boasting about his new real estate acquisitions. He went to sleep that night in his heated mansion, entirely unbothered, believing he was untouchable. Have you ever sat at a table filled with people who use their wealth and status to make you feel completely invisible? Have you ever had a partner sit beside you and laugh along with the people abusing you? What would you have done sitting at that Thanksgiving table? Would you have caused a scene, or would you have smiled knowing that you held the legal key to their absolute destruction in your pocket? Tell me in the comments, because the hardest, most agonizing part of revenge is the discipline required to stay silent until the trap is fully sprung. Now, let me tell you what happens when a narcissistic billionaire realizes that the federal government does not care about his country club membership. Which brings us right back to where we started. Black Friday, the morning after the Thanksgiving massacre. At 5 a.m., while Greg was snoring off his hangover in our bedroom, I quietly slipped out of the house. I drove to the federal staging area. I changed out of the clearance rack sweater I had worn to dinner and put on a tailored black blazer, dark slacks, and a Kevlar vest. I clipped my heavy gold IRS-CI badge to a silver chain around my neck. At precisely 8:00 a.m., the frosted glass doors of Sterling Pinnacle Real Estate were pushed open. The raid was a symphony of overwhelming federal force. 15 armed special agents flooded the 32nd floor. They moved with absolute, terrifying efficiency. One team immediately breached the IT server rooms, securing the hard drives and preventing any remote data wiping. Another team secured the filing cabinets. I walked into Richard's corner office just as he slammed his gold Patek Philippe watch against his imported Italian marble desk, screaming at the lead agent. "Do you have any idea who I am?" Richard bellowed, his face flushing a dangerous apoplectic purple. "I play golf with the mayor! Get out of my office before I have every single one of you fired!" That is when I stepped out from the hallway and stood perfectly still in the doorway of his office. Richard's gaze shifted to me. I want you to really visualize this moment. His brain struggled, frantically trying to reconcile the image of the submissive, low-class daughter-in-law he had humiliated at his dinner table 12 hours ago, with the cold, authoritative federal investigator standing before him, flanked by armed agents. He saw my tailored suit. He saw the Kevlar vest. And then his eyes locked onto the heavy gold federal badge resting on my chest. The color physically drained from his face, his jaw went slack. The arrogance, the toxic bravado, the illusion of his untouchable wealth, all of it evaporated in a single, terrifying second. His hands began to tremble so violently he had to grip the edge of his marble desk just to stay standing. "Chloe!" Richard stammered, his voice a weak, pathetic wheeze. What What is this? I stepped into the office, my heels clicking sharply against the hardwood floor. I didn't raise my voice. I spoke to him with the cold, clinical detachment of a CEO reading a quarterly bankruptcy report. "Good morning, Richard," I said smoothly. "As I told you last night at dinner, my paperwork is far from boring." I unclasped a thick, red-stamped federal folder from my arm and placed it directly onto the center of his desk, right next to his dropped gold watch. "This is a federal search and seizure warrant," I explained, leaning slightly forward, ensuring my voice was low, lethal, and perfectly audible to the agents securing his files. "You are under investigation for multi-million-dollar tax evasion, wire fraud, and the use of a 501c3 charitable organization to launder real estate capital through shell entities located in the Cayman Islands." Richard gasped, his chest heaving as if the oxygen had been sucked out of the room. He knew the terms, he knew exactly what those specific charges meant. You set me up," he whispered, a tear of pure, terrified defeat welling in his eye. "You're my daughter-in-law. You can't do this to family." I offered him a slow, utterly serene smile. It was the exact same smile I had given him across the Thanksgiving table. "You're right, Richard. I spend 40 hours a week sitting at a desk, stamping forms for the government," I said, repeating the exact words he had used to condemn me. "A truly boring existence. But today, I am the one seizing every single hard drive, bank account, and physical asset you have ever owned to pay back the taxes you stole." He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. He was completely, legally paralyzed. "Now step away from the desk," I commanded, my voice dropping the polite facade entirely, "before I have the agents place you in handcuffs for interfering with a federal investigation." Richard stumbled backward, collapsing into a leather guest chair, holding his head in his hands as my team began tearing his empire apart, brick by brick. The fallout wasn't just rapid. It was a total, nuclear annihilation of his reality. By noon, the news of the IRS raid hit the local financial press. By 2 p.m., Richard's major investors were pulling their capital. His bank accounts were officially frozen under federal order. At 4 p.m., my personal phone rang. It was Greg. "Chloe, what the hell did you do?" Greg screamed, his voice hysterical and frantic. "Dad's lawyers are saying the feds seized the company. They froze my trust fund accounts. You have to tell them to stop. You have to fix this." I stood in the lobby of the federal building, looking out at the city, feeling completely weightless. "I can't fix it, Greg," I said calmly. "Your father committed federal fraud. I just did the paperwork." "You betrayed your family," he yelled, sobbing into the receiver. "You're a monster!" "No, Greg," I replied, the years of pain crystallizing into one final, liberating truth. "I was your wife. I sat at that table for 5 years while your father treated me like trash, and you laughed right along with him. You chose his money over my dignity. Well, now the money is gone." I hung up the phone. I didn't block his number. I just set my phone to do not disturb. I walked into the courthouse across the street and filed the divorce papers I had drafted 3 weeks prior. I walked away clean, taking only my salary and my peace of mind. Richard didn't have a high-priced legal team to save him because his assets were frozen. He had to rely on a court-appointed public defender to navigate one of the most complex slam-dunk federal tax fraud cases of the decade. He was indicted on 14 counts of wire fraud and tax evasion. Facing 25 years in a federal penitentiary, he took a plea deal. He was sentenced to 12 years in federal prison. He was stripped of all his assets, including the sprawling 8-bedroom estate, which was seized and sold at public auction to pay back the millions he owed the IRS in restitution and penalties. Greg, the golden boy who had never learned a marketable skill, was forced to move into a tiny 2-bedroom apartment. He is currently working as an assistant manager at a mid-tier rental car agency, completely ostracized from the country club elite he used to worship. Let's break the fourth wall one last time. Looking at a narcissistic, abusive titan being stripped of everything he ever used to humiliate others. Do you think I was too cruel by staying silent at the dinner table? Or was letting him dig his own grave the most poetic justice possible? Looking back at the quiet, submissive girl I had to pretend to be for 5 years, I realized something profound about survival and revenge. Toxic people, especially narcissistic family members, operate on a psychological system called conditional self-worth. They believe that a person's value is entirely dictated by their bank account, their title, or how useful they are to the narcissist's ego. Richard treated me like dirt because my government salary didn't fit his delusion of grandeur. He needed me to feel small so he could feel massive. But when you realize that someone's arrogance is just a fragile mask covering a pathetic, hollow core, they lose all their power over you. Setting a boundary, walking away from abuse, or quietly handing over evidence of a crime is not causing drama. It is the ultimate act of self-respect. You cannot heal in the same environment that actively tries to break you. You are not the labels they assign to you. You are not the help. You are not a disappointment. And you are certainly not defined by the job you do to survive. The greatest revenge isn't screaming across a dinner table. The greatest revenge is walking away in absolute silence, doing your job perfectly, and building a life so unshakable, so legally and ethically ironclad that they can never touch you again. And if they happen to stumble into your jurisdiction along the way, well, someone has to do the paperwork. Thank you for listening to my story. If you found a piece of yourself in this, or if you simply appreciate the cold, calculated mechanics of true legal karma, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and share this video with someone who needs a reminder of their own resilience. Stay strong, protect your peace, and always keep your receipts. I will see you in the next story.